like The Martian, but I have this one friend who loves The Martian. They read it probably more times than I've read World War Z, and I swear every time I tell them to go read World War Z, they go and read The Martian, and, hey, go read World War Z. But a couple days ago, we were hanging out, and one of the first scenes in the book talks about Mark Watney's suit bloodletting oxygen, and my friend asked me what that meant. And the book explains the process so well that I could clarify for my friend why his suit would need to get rid of excess oxygen and why too high of an oxygen content hurts us. Then my friend said, "Oh no, I understood that. I meant what's bloodletting." And the book did not explain what that is, so the explanation I could give is that sometimes we get ghosts in our blood, so we need to cut ourselves open and bleed into a bucket for a while just to let the ghosts out.
Ghosts.
But that's the amazing thing about The Martian. It takes all these massive, complex, scientific concepts and explains them so well that anyone can understand them, to the point where a completely science-illiterate person like myself could understand and explain in what I thought was a pretty good way why Mark Watney's suit had to bloodlet oxygen. And I will go on about how amazingly written this book is at the end of the video. Gotta keep you invested, so on to the synopsis. Let's talk about Andy Weir's The Martian.
Mr. Martian!
So, The Martian follows Mark Watney, an astronaut who's part of the Ares 3 crew, the third expedition to Mars, who gets lost and injured in a windstorm, which leads to his crew fleeing and leaving him behind on Mars. Which is a problem, because it takes 2 years in the best of times to get from Earth to Mars. And in some ways, that's fine for Mark. The habitat, or HAB, where he and the other astronauts were living, can recycle oxygen and water, but it can't recycle food. So Mark has to figure out how to grow several years' worth of food on Mars. And luckily, Mark's a botanist, and NASA sent the crew up there with potatoes. And if you are ever stuck on a desert island and can only pick one food to bring, make it potatoes. Potatoes are asexual propagators, so you can grow more if you have just one, which Mark does, and they contain almost all of the nutrients people need to survive. You'll still get scurvy, but you'll live long enough and remain healthy enough to get scurvy. And for the record, Mark has multivitamins and stuff, so he does not get scurvy.
Pirates!
So Mark gets to work digging up part of the HAB and turning the Mars soil into something that can sustain life, which is already a pain because the soil on Mars is basically all basalt and iron oxide. If you wanted to, you could take it, compact it without any other ingredients and make bricks. Which is great for building, but not farming, as Minecraft will tell you. And the book goes on these long scientific explanations for how he infuses the soil with bacteria to allow the potatoes to grow, how he messes with the hydrocene or rocket fuel to make water, and all the technical aspects of just getting anything done on Mars. And it never does it in a boring or hard to understand way.
I'm confused.
And while Mark is working on growing his potatoes, he's also trying to figure out how he'll get home. Originally, he thinks that he'll need to wait for the next Mars mission to arrive in 2 years and hitchhike with them. The only problem is that their landing site is clear on the other side of Mars, so at some point he'll need to leave the HAB and go on a road trip to the next landing site. And luckily, Mark has a Mars rover, so he can actually go on a road trip. So we also get long technical explanations for how he plans to put everything he needs to sustain his life, as well as the solar panels to power it all, on the rover, and take that all to the other side of Mars. And while he's figuring this out, he goes and runs errands in the rover, like to pick up a box of radiation that will help keep him warm, and to go cannibalize a Mars rover that we actually sent up there in the 90s, Pathfinder.
Road trip! Road trip! Road trip!
And it's these errands that ends up progressing the plot, because NASA, who's watching Mars, realizes that the rover is moving, and the only way it could move is if a person were there. That's how they discover Mark's alive, and they royally messed up. So then there's this big scramble to try and communicate with Mark, which he is also working on. That's part of why he goes and finds Pathfinder, to try and find a way to communicate with NASA. And it works. They start communicating, and it's amazing, and also a complete shit show for the PR team at NASA, who has to tell the media that they forgot Mark.
You forgot me!
And that's a big subplot of the book. The people at NASA are trying to decide how to save Mark, and for a long time they're doing this while trying not to let Mark's old crew, who are still in space on their way home, know. And a lot of their story is the back and forth and the bureaucracy of just trying to get anything done, which is really funny when it's juxtaposed against Mark, because he doesn't need to ask anyone before he goes and gets his box of radiation, even though it has people at NASA ripping their hair out. But NASA starts jumping through hoops because they want to send Mark supplies to tide him over until the next manned mission to Mars arrives. But it's hard to build a rocket, and they really could use all the money in the world, but people aren't inclined to give them that after they messed up so bad abandoning Mark. But they work with what they've got to actually get a rocket together, pack it with food, and get it on its way to Mars. And they almost succeed. They get so far as to get a rocket off the ground, only to have a bolt that was overlooked in their rush break and cause the whole rocket to come tumbling back down. So in the eyes of Earth, Mark is screwed. They just doomed him to starve, because while they were doing this, Mark had a technical issue.
No service!
Mark's first yield of potatoes goes great, until the airlock that's connecting the mini farm rips apart, plunging his farm into the desolate outside world and killing all his potatoes. And that was actually a really cool part, because the potatoes get flash frozen and die, but the bacteria Mark put in the soil actually survives. Life will find a way. And anyway, Mark has more potatoes than he started out with, but not a 2-year supply, and NASA Uber Eats order isn't coming anymore. So NASA is scrambling to try and figure out how to save Mark, and they decide to try and send another Uber Eats order, this time using a rocket that they begged China for. And while that's happening, Mark's crew finally learns, thanks to a leak, that Mark's alive, and they decide not to take the risk with the rocket they're sending from China, and instead they'll intercept it and grab all the supplies they need, then turn around and go pick up Mark themselves. And NASA is mad about this, but there's not much they can do. If these people want to go get a box of radiation, they can.
Leaking? What's leaking?
So now Mark has to scramble to get to the Ares 4 landing site because his crew can't land their rocket. But the Ares 4 site has a rocket already that can get Mark into orbit for the pickup. So then the book turns into a road trip story. Mark, just like he practiced, loads everything up on the rover and starts on his journey. And there's actually a part where Mark almost gets screwed over again by a dust storm, but he figures it out and manages to get to the land site. And this is probably where the book diverts the most from the movie, because in the book, everyone has stuff they need to do to man the rocket, and it's dramatic, but not Hollywood dramatic, trying to pick him up. He does not open his spacesuit and fly like Iron Man to the other astronaut. And the book doesn't end with any of the Ares 3 crew still working at NASA. It ends with Mark unraveling a little after everything he went through, only to be offered a job with a private space agency to go back into space. And in spite of everything, he's tempted.
Let's take a rocket ship.
Alright, where to start on the writing in The Martian? The book is complex in so many ways. There's, of course, the scientific complexity, but there's also the complexity of the writing. Most of the book is written in first person from Mark's point of view. The framing device is that his part of the book are his logs that he kept on Mars. If there's something he didn't want to include, we don't see it. And there are parts he skims over, but that helps keep the book engaging. We don't need to hear all the gory details of all his injuries, but he's passionate about botany, and he goes into detail there, and because he's having fun explaining it, it's fun to read about. And I also really liked that Mark broke stuff down for the common man to understand. Because those smart characters that go on in technobabble, only to say they can't be any clearer or act like everyone else is so dumb for not getting it, are annoying. If you want to write a smart guy character that your readers will actually like, Mark Watney is it.
Smart guy.
But the characterization is also one of the weaker parts of the story. This is a very plot-heavy book, with a lot of characters, and after reading it a few times, Mark is really the only character I can name offhand. I like the other characters, but I can't name them, and I don't know much about them, which is fine. If you're writing a plot-driven book, you have a lot you can learn here. But this isn't a book that will teach you much on how to write compelling, memorable characters. And a part of that comes from the book changing points of view for every character other than Mark.
Other people? What other people?
The parts of the book that follow NASA are written in third person, and the book actually does third person limited omniscient and third person objective. When we're following actual people, it's third person limited omniscient, and we're following the internal thoughts of one person at a time. But a few times, like with that damn screw that messed up NASA's first Uber Eats order, we get a description of what went wrong and how in third person objective, not from a human's perspective. It reads like an analytical report explaining what went wrong and why. And breaking up those points of view can be risky. You have to be a good writer to change perspectives like that and still keep the tone of the story consistent. You thought I'd finally get through a video without using that word, huh? And without making it confusing, but the book handled that so well. Even in the darkest moments, regardless of what perspective we're at, there's still humor.
Very funny.
And that's another part of the book that makes it so good. There's so much humor in the book, so many jokes, so many big, important people just calling each other jerks that makes you laugh. I'm so sure this is another book that had me crying and laughing at work. But the humor helped keep the book fun. The movie was fun, but for me, the humor in the movie wasn't prominent enough to offset the torture porn there was watching Mark treat his wounds. There were parts that were explained in the book, but not in great detail, and that allowed for a better balance between the humor, suspense, and science. And the scientific writing in the book is just so amazing.
Science!
Alright, I think it's time we need to talk about the elephant in the room. Specifically, this elephant, which has its own little hab like Mark does. We should also talk about the sandstorm, which was the biggest scientific inaccuracy in the book. Apparently a dust storm like the one that caused Mark to get left behind couldn't happen. Dust storms on Mars just aren't powerful enough to really blow anything heavy like a human or rocket around. And Andy Weir has actually talked about how he would change that to still make it work in a scientifically accurate way. And that's because he's gotten feedback. And that's part of how The Martian got so scientifically accurate. Andy Weir put the story online and got feedback from the whole internet and tons of people with their own knowledge as he was writing. And I can only imagine how much that helped, getting the knowledge as well as the feedback from people on what did and didn't work, where the story got confusing for the average person, and where all the technobabble got boring. And that's probably the scariest part of the book and the biggest takeaway, sharing your work.
I would now like to share.
It is scary sharing your writing, especially in the day and age of AI, when AI will steal your writing to feed its own algorithms. But the best way to improve your writing is to find a community, find people to bounce ideas off of, get beta and sensitivity readers, and share your work. These videos are scary, but I've already become a better writer because I make them, and I'm made an even better writer thanks to the writing communities I'm a part of. So go write, and go read The Martian.